Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Culture Clash Podcast, where typically a Russian and American discuss and debate some of the hot news topics of the week. Unfortunately, it's just me today. Vlad isn't here. He had some obligations. So I'm going to be taking us through two topics that were in the news recently and responding to questions that Vlad had posed to me ahead of time. So with that, the two topics for today revolve around the situation with the drug cartels in Mexico, the spiraling violence, if there's anything that can be done about that. And then it's going to be about the obesity crisis and what we're seeing, not just in the U.S., but also globally. And again, what some of the solutions to that might be. So with that, I want to start with the cartel question and sort of where this originated from. So there was an article in the Washington Post last week about how a U.S. drug arrest whether it made Mexico more violent, which is referring to the outbreak of violence that has been happening in the Sinaloa province, Sinaloa state in Mexico. So Vlad's question to me is, in July, the U.S. arrested Sinaloa cartel leader El Mayo Zambada, which comes after El Chapo, one of the other bosses, was arrested a few years ago. And his question is there any hope of reducing violence in the drug war in Mexico and then, again, more broadly in Central and South America? So my answer to that is emphatically no, absolutely not. And I don't say that with any, I don't say that happily, obviously. I think it's a really, it's a terrible situation. It's a really sad situation. But to understand where this violence is coming from, and this violence, of course, does play a role and does impact the United States in a number of ways. So again, whether it's inter-drug conflict, inter-gang conflict, I should say, within the U.S., whether it's the implications to the countries themselves, to stability within Mexico, within some of these other countries. The violence and the spiraling situation obviously does have an impact much wider than just the general community directly affected. So the reasons why I'm very pessimistic on any sort of solution taking place, not just now, not just in 2 years' time, really at any point in the foreseeable future, is because you need to understand sort of, or I would argue you need to understand where this sort of problem originated from. So I had done a lot of research on the backs of this question, trying to understand where did this come from? Where did this violence come from? Why is it so unique to Central and South America? And again, what is the future of trying to resolve this? So you really need to go back into understanding how these cartels operate, what the conflict is really over, what the fight is all about, and then again, try to understand what some of the solutions might be. So broadly speaking, this spiraling of violence really began in the 1980s, and you could see that again. It's been made famous by a number of movies, by some great TV shows, Netflix shows like Narcos and others that really revolve around the rise of the Colombian cartels. So again, the Medellin cartel, Pablo Escobar, of course, very famous. You had the Cali cartel. You had a number of these organizations that rose on the backs of mainly it was the cocaine trade in the 1970s, 1980s, and through the 1990s. So what you saw is that during that period, Colombia had been the most dangerous country in the world, or at least parts of Colombia were at different times the most dangerous cities. And broadly speaking, it was one of the most dangerous countries in the world. And again, why specifically that was the case? Why nowhere else in the world? Why did these cartels and why did this part of the world get particularly dangerous, particularly violent? All of that has to do around the economics behind the trade. So cocaine is a very interesting drug when you compare it to some of the other drugs out there, whether it be marijuana, whether it be heroin, things like that. It's uniquely profitable, which obviously drives the huge revenues, the huge profits that these criminal organizations are able to take in. So just to give an idea, and I had to do some research into understanding the economics behind the trade, it costs roughly $3 per gram to cultivate the coca leaf. So again, the coca leaf is sort of the foundational piece, because cocaine does originate from a plant, the coca leaf, which had been chewed and which had been used by native people for hundreds of years, perhaps thousands of years, to give them energy, to give them some sort of pickup, very similar to caffeine, very similar to coffee. Once it was synthesized and used to be able to mass produce what's now cocaine, the huge increase in profits could be seen when you would then export the drug to the end market, which was the United States. So to cultivate just the leaf itself, it only costs you $3 per gram to do that. When you eventually get to the street level, and when you eventually get to dealing that cocaine in its pure form, You're able to sell that in the U.S., for example, on the street for $125 a gram. So you're really looking at absurd, obscene profits, 40 times the profit you can make from the growth to the eventual sale on the street. So if you think economically, if you think of of owning a stock, for example, you consider if I wanted to invest in the S&P 500, if my investment grows 20% year over year, that's a phenomenal investment. If I double my money, that's a tremendous investment. These criminal organizations, these cartels, when investing that initial capital to grow the coca leaf, to eventually want to deal that drug, you're looking at 40 times profits, which is unbelievable, which obviously is what's driving the huge amount of money that they're able to make. And again, cocaine is quite unique in that ability, in that profitability, where again, a lot of these other drugs don't have that same profitability. Now, some of the reasons for that are a few. One being, it's a very unique drug in the sense also where it's grown and cultivated. It's only grown in South America. So you need very particular conditions for the coca leaf to thrive. You need typically higher elevations. You need a bit of humidity. You need plenty of sunlight. So you need some sort of mix of a jungle-like environment, yet at higher elevations, but also with a lot of sunlight. So again, South America is very unique globally for having the perfect conditions and in some ways, some of the only conditions for the coca leaf to thrive. So you're looking at a drug, a highly addictive drug, where it's only cultivated or even able to be cultivated in a very small piece of territory. So again, Colombia is by far the #1 producer. Then you have Peru, a little bit of a ways below that. And then you have Bolivia sort of way off as the third largest producer. But again, South America, broadly speaking, is where this is able to be grown in quantity. So you have, again, a very small geographic area where these criminal organizations, again, are able to control and thrive and whatnot. And then once you're able to get that, all you need to do is get it to the United States. And then once you do, obviously, the United States is a relatively wealthy country. People are willing to spend quite a bit of money for their illegal drugs or whatever the case is. So that's then driving that huge increase in the value from getting the product from point A to point B, being point A in South America to point B being in the United States on the street. So that obviously drove these huge profits and these huge revenues that these South American cartels were able to make back in the 1980s, back in the 1990s, Pablo Escobar, etc. These organizations were so well funded, they were able to fight their own governments. For example, Pablo Escobar waged more or less a narco-civil war against the Colombian government for multiple years and was able to do that on the backs of only that drug revenue. So again, that's sort of the foundation, and that's where that all sort of stems from. So then what ended up happening, and why this violence has largely moved to Mexico, is that in the 1990s, you had a concerted effort once Pablo Escobar was killed, once the Cali cartel was broken up, sort of the two main cartels in the 1970s, 1980s, and even into the 90s. You then had a sort of a concerted effort from the United States government, a plan called Plan Colombia, in order to try to bolster the Colombian government, support Colombia, which was and is a major U.S. ally, in its fight against drug trafficking. Because again, drug trafficking, of course, with that amount of money and whatnot, you have a tremendous amount of influence to be able to influence the country, destabilize the country, etc. So the Americans had this plan to pump a lot of money, equipment, training, pretty much anything that you would expect a government to need to be able to combat some of these organizations. Part of that plan also was to deploy naval assets, aerial assets into the Gulf of Mexico, into the Pacific Ocean, to interdict these drug trafficking routes. So again, the typical way, the historical way back in the 1980s and 1990s for these cartels to transport their illegal drugs was through sea. So they would go through the Gulf of Mexico, through the Pacific Ocean. They would then maybe stop at some of these Caribbean islands. Very famously, one of the associates of Pablo Escobar bought a private island in the Caribbean only as a hub to be able to receive the illegal drugs and then to be able to bring them to the United States. So the United States had a concerted effort, deployed naval assets, et cetera, to be able to stop that. That was very successful. Again, not all that difficult to be able to patrol your coastline and everything else. You're looking for speedboats. You're looking for, low-flying planes. It's not all that difficult to be able to put a stop to it. So that was largely interdicted, and that had a huge impact on the ability of these organizations to be able to move that product across borders. Then what ended up happening is that the value chain moved, because when you're dealing with these type of organizations and anything having to relate to this sort of trafficking world and all of that, the value is in moving that product from point A to point B. So now moving it from point A was more difficult. So now you needed a different conduit, a different route. And that's where Mexico stepped in. So Mexico has the 8th largest border in the world. So the U.S.-Mexico border, 8th largest in the world, 2,000 miles long. Again, massive border. Much of it is completely unsupervised. It's completely empty. You have huge stretches of desert. Then you have rivers, and then you have urban areas. Really complex border, very large border, and again, a very large border. So the value then came not from the Colombians themselves, but from the Colombians bringing it to Mexico, where then the Mexican organizations were then going to be the ones to traffic that contraband into the U.S. So that's where that value and that profitability really sort of rose significantly for the Mexican organizations. So the Colombian organizations, in comparison, decreased in their relative value, while the Mexican organizations proved to be the most valuable part of that chain. So you can almost think about it like when Apple is making an iPhone, you have the people who are producing the phone, then you have the people who are shipping the phone. But at the end of the day, Apple, the company, the ones marketing the product, bringing the product together, engineering the product and eventually selling the product is where most of the value is. You can almost think of the Mexican cartels the same way. So all this sort of contraband, all of this material was then coming through Mexico. These organizations then began to fight over the routes to be able to bring that into the United States. And again, what we've seen over the last 20, 25 years is an explosion of violence in Mexico, as that's now been the heart of where the value chain is in the drug trafficking from South America into the United States. So what we've seen there is, again, a number of organizations rise and fall, but again, almost always some level of conflict over these major routes. So again, that's made cities like Tijuana, right on the U.S. border. It's made cities like Matamoros and some of these other that are right along the border, some of the most dangerous cities in the world. Anywhere where there's sort of a valuable trade route or trafficking route, these areas have seen tremendous amounts of violence and a lot of fighting between the cartels to establish dominance and to be able to reap the profits of, again, a very profitable drug trade. So then what we've seen is that, okay, the Americans have, before I get into that, so again, if you want to think even more broadly about this border and why it's so difficult to police relative to, again, the Gulf of Mexico and some of the other efforts that the American government has made, you're talking about a border, again, I mentioned the 8th largest border in the world. It's also crossed by 400 million people a year. 400 million people come across that border on an annual basis. Over 100 million cars. There's $800 billion of trade between the U.S. and Mexico. It's the most lucrative and largest bilateral trade relationship on the planet. $1.5 billion a day is generated from these cross-border activities. So you're talking about how do you then stop that, right? I mean, it could be as simple as people, 400 million of them who cross the border every day could be involved in this. You're talking about 100 million vehicles. How do you inspect all those vehicles? It's a Herculean challenge that, of course, hasn't been solved, and there really hasn't been a solution to it up to this point. So again, that's driven a lot of the violence. That's driven the rise of some of these cartels. That's driven the rise of these cartels to align themselves with some of the organizations in Colombia, for example, and to then really assert their dominance on the industry. And again, now the problem that you have is the longer that these organizations are able to thrive, what you're now seeing is that the relationship to Europe, there's a lot of obviously export from Mexico to Europe of these same drugs, of these same contraband and whatnot. So you've had this sort of metastasization of the problem as it's moved to Mexico. So then what you have is the question of American strategy, and this is the question that the article raises, is American policy to blame or is somehow involved in what's happening? So the U.S. has adopted what's been called the kingpin strategy, and it's had this strategy now for a number of decades, where the U.S. will go after and target some of the leaders of these organizations, bring them to justice, extradite them to the U.S. So again, El Chapo is sitting in a prison in the U.S. You had a lot of the associates of the Medellin cartel from the 80s. You've had a lot of the associates of some of the older Mexican cartels still sitting in prison in the United States. And the idea being that the Americans will disincentivize the leadership to pursue these actions, activities, whatever, in an effort to try to dampen the trade. All that's happened is that the trade has exploded. So, for example, I have a data point here, if I can just pull it up. So, for example, if you're looking at global cocaine production, and we're only talking about this one drug because of its profitability, but there's a lot of other drugs and a lot of other illegal activities that these organizations have really thrived participating in. But cocaine production in 1994 was 891 metric tons. 2021, it was 2,300 metric tons. So you're talking about almost a tripling in the production and cultivation of cocaine, okay? So clearly whatever's been tried hasn't been working, and the problem is only metastasizing, as I said. So then you've got the American policy of trying to take out these leaders. And that's exactly what happened over the summer, which is where this article came from. So you've had the largest organization in Mexico, the most successful drug cartel, probably everybody's heard of it, the Sinaloa Cartel. So again, it was headed by a guy named El Chapo, who I think most people know, who's now in prison in the U.S. And one of his associates was a guy named Almayo Zambada. So finally, the U.S. was able to capture this guy. They'd been looking for him for maybe 30 or 40 years. They arrested him over the summer back in July. The result of that, rather than bringing peace, rather than controlling the drug issue or the drug conflict, has led to massive violence that's broken out in that state of Sinaloa where the cartel is headquartered. So you've now had a relative splintering of the group where now you've got these two groups fighting each other. El Chapo's former associates, and then you have El Mayo's former associates. So all that's been accomplished by that action, which was to arrest Almayo Zambada, has been this explosion in violence in Sinaloa. And you see that in most situations in Mexico. When you've had these major arrests, when you've brought down one cartel, there's only another cartel that comes in to fill the void. So we've seen that historically in the 50 years since the drug war's begun, that's always where it goes. So arresting a leader, trying to do something about this issue rarely actually leads to the solution, but instead typically ends in more violence. So we've historically seen when you've had maybe one cartel, one successful cartel, that's typically when violence is maybe reduced, but it's the rivalry itself, the inter-gang warfare, where you have a lot of this issue, which is causing the violence to metastasize. So what we've seen in particular, so you've had, for example, in 2020, it was the deadliest year in Mexico. 2021 was even deadlier than that. So Mexico's almost on an annual, 2019 had been the deadliest year in Mexico. You've seen on almost an annual basis, the violence continues to metastasize and continues to get worse. And it's driven by these massive profits that could be gained. Again, cocaine was the foundation of it, but now you have a larger problem. Now you have the issue of fentanyl, for example, which is causing a huge political issue in the U.S. because of how deadly it is and how that's now contaminated a lot of the illegal, but also some of the legal drugs. And again, a lot of that's coming from Mexico. So between obviously other types of illicit activity, human trafficking, these organizations continue to get more and more powerful, continue to grow in their size and influence and financial resources. And again, that violence is only getting worse, which then brings us to the initial question, which is this going to go anywhere? Is there any future, for combating the drug violence? So again, I think I've laid out by and large where this has come from, where we are today, sort of how things look from a macro perspective. And again, the reason why I'm so pessimistic, and I would say absolutely not, I don't think there's any hope of this ending anytime soon, is if you go even larger than that. So we talked about the profitability, we talked about the why the Mexican trade routes are so important. But if you go into the actual revenue these organizations make, the size and scope of these organizations, this data is very hard to come by, but there's a lot of estimates that have been made. So in Mexico, for example, you're talking about a country where people wonder, how is it that such criminality can exist? How is it that they can't really get a hold on the issue? It's very simple, and it's really, I think, even no fault of Mexico, to be honest. If you look at the largest companies in Mexico by revenue, just as an example. So Pemex, which is the state oil company in Mexico, largest company by revenue substantially, they make $92 billion a year in revenue. Again, that's the state oil company for a major oil producing country in Mexico. The number two company in the country is Walmart Mexico, which makes $52 billion a year. And then the third is something called America Mobile, which is a telecom company owned by Carlos Slim, one of the richest guys in the world, $48 billion of revenue per year. Now, if you look at how much the drug cartels in Mexico make, and you add all that revenue up, again, these estimates are relatively imprecise. They're only estimates because these guys obviously don't report their finances. They're not audited by anybody. But you're looking at roughly $50 billion a year in revenue for these drug cartels, for these criminal organizations. That would rank them the second or third largest company in Mexico. So how are you going to handle that problem if the second or third largest company in your country, again, is making that money on a fully illicit basis, all of their revenue, all of their products, all of their services, if you want to sort of compare them to a corporation, are illegal? Obviously, that's a huge problem for them. If you then look at also the how many people they employ. So again, people think about, well, can't you just arrest everybody? Direct employees of these criminal organizations, again, by estimates, are 175,000 people, which would make them the fifth largest employer in Mexico. That's direct members of the organization. That doesn't count the people that they're paying or paying off or bribing or whatever the case is. So once you think about it in those terms, this would be the second or third largest company in Mexico, the fifth largest direct employer, and possibly the largest if you consider the people that they're paying off, the people who are somehow related to the business. You're talking about a Herculean problem. How are you going to grapple with that? How are you going to get your hands around that? I don't see how you can. I really don't see what the immediate solution is. So again, when this goes into what is the solution, how are you going to come to some sort of capacity to solve it? The Americans have put out a few new ideas. So again, the Trump administration, some of his surrogates, him included, has mentioned over the past couple of years, well, you could go in and you could bomb them, you could attack them, you could deploy the U.S. military. So again, I think it sounds good on paper because, again, you're just looking for a solution, which is obviously what's currently been policy isn't working. These organizations are only growing in size, only getting stronger, only diversifying their businesses, which is obviously having an impact on their revenue and their capacity to influence policy. So again, just to very quickly very quickly give an example of that, and we could show a video of this, but when El Chapo's son was arrested in Culiacan, which is the capital of Sinaloa, he had been arrested, I think it was 2018 or 2019, and immediately upon his arrest, the entire city erupted into violence. The cartel came out, surrounded the police, blockaded all of the roads, and pretty much had a huge gun battle where they had outgunned the police. I think it was the federal police in Mexico. So again, not local police, not your local sheriffs, but the actual, national police force outgunned them to the point that the president of Mexico had to give a press conference and say he was directly ordering, and he told the people of Mexico this in a press conference, we're going to let El Chapo's son go. We don't want to see any violence, which just goes to show the power and influence that these organizations have to get the president himself to stand down and to make a statement and a press conference to his people explaining why he was standing down. So this is obviously a massive issue and something that really doesn't have a simple solution. So again, people then say, okay, let's deploy the military, let's bomb them, let's send troops or whatever the case is. But again, I think what's unique about this issue and why in this case I don't think that makes all that much sense at all is you're talking about an organization that is moving a product. So you would essentially need to invade Mexico, invade the sovereign country. And again, where are you even going to be targeting? So again, the product that they're the illegal drugs are in warehouses. They're in possibly houses. They might be underground. It's a product at the end of the day. How I can't even fathom how they would plan on doing it, even if you knew where some of these warehouses were. People say, well, you can bomb them, you can deploy troops, you can send special forces. At some point, it would just move. So you would go maybe from one warehouse to a new warehouse. New routes would open up. The profitability actually would go through the roof because there would still be that demand. So the demand side in the United States, the largest drug market in the world, would still be there. Europe, the second largest drug market in the world, that would still be there. So you can go in and short of a full-on occupation of at least northern Mexico, maybe the entire country, I don't see really how you can have any lasting solution there at all, except to destroy the bilateral U.S.-Mexico relationship, have a lot of people die needlessly on both sides of the border. You'd have obviously American troops, you would have Mexican civilians, and then again, you run the risk of creating and making worse a drug conflict within the U.S. itself, because these organizations are also the ones dealing in the streets in the United States. So overall, I think it's a really complex issue. But long story short, to answer Vlad's question, I don't think you have any easy solution. I don't think this violence is going to go anywhere. And in fact, what you're seeing, it's actually getting worse in many ways. So people bring up the example of El Salvador, which has gotten a grip on its criminal violence, and obviously under Bukele, they've made the penalties for drug crimes and a lot of crimes in the country much more significant, much more severe. They now, I think, have the largest prison population as a percentage of the population globally. They've done a lot of things, but what you see is, again, it really goes where the economics go. So the different trade routes open up. Now you have Ecuador, which is a country that used to be considered one of the most peaceful in Latin America, or maybe even the most peaceful, has now broken out, and I think now is the second or third most dangerous country in Latin America, because now they're utilizing the port there to export, again, cocaine or whatever the illegal drugs are from Ecuador or from deeper within South America. So the problem doesn't go away, it might just move. What doesn't move, what doesn't change is Mexico, because obviously you've got the 2,000-mile border, you've got direct access to the biggest drug market in the world, in the United States, and that's why I think really, short of legalizing not just marijuana, which still hasn't even been done at the federal level, short of maybe legalizing cocaine or legalizing some really hard and illicit drugs, short of that, I don't really see what the clear solution is. I really don't see what folks would propose to do. But I think, long story short, I think very unfortunately, I don't see a solution to this. I don't see this going anywhere. And I think it's only going to get much worse before maybe it gets better. But I think, again, I don't know how that's going to happen unless you convince everybody in the US and in Europe, stop doing drugs, stop using cocaine. That is the way to do it. But obviously, we haven't seen demand move in that direction. We've seen it get worse. So I think, unfortunately, pessimistically, I would have to say the answer to that question for me is hard no chance that anything changes. So now the second question coming from Vlad, who is, again, was too scared to debate today. I guess he needs a little bit of rest. He was asking me about the global obesity crisis. So he's asking me, with the global obesity crisis continuing to get worse, is this something to be solved with more healthcare spending, or is it a lifestyle issue? Okay, so I went into quite a bit of research around this. I think people don't fully grasp or appreciate just how bad this obesity crisis is and is getting. Again, now and over the next few years, the projections are terrible. I think what we've seen over the past few years are awful in the growth of obesity globally, particularly in the U.S. But again, it's now a problem that we're seeing outside the U.S., in Latin America in particular, in Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa. And I mean, it's global. No part of the world is spared from this issue. So just to give people an idea, this was a recent article that was published around obesity in the U.S. Currently, in 2021, 76% of American men and 76% of American adult men and 73% of adult women in 2021 were obese or overweight. 76% of men, 73% of women, adults, overweight or obese. The projections are by 2050, that number will rise to 81% of men and 82% of women. So that's 260 million people who are projected to be overweight or obese, which is obviously a horrific statistic. So you talk about healthcare, the issues around healthcare, the amount the U.S. spends on an annual basis, and obviously these problems are projected to only get worse. So again, obesity, why it matters? Because again, there's this debate nowadays, which I think is absurd, around, do we sort of normalize being obese? Do we normalize being overweight? And again, I think it's just an absurd and ludicrous notion. There's one thing about normalizing and respecting people and their choices and all of that, but normalizing it to the extent that there's this movement and there's this sort of there's been raised this cultural question in the U.S. of should we be asking doctors not to ask patients their weight or to step on a scale for fear of offending them, because obviously the scale is going to be, they're going to maybe break the scale or whatever the case is, because people have gotten much more, overweight and obese. And it's just such an alarming, I think, cultural trend. It's such an alarming idea to normalize overweight and obesity because of how detrimental it is to people's health. So again, what we see is that obesity worsens the risks significantly of diabetes, heart disease, cancer, you name it, self-esteem, mental health, just basic physical fitness. It's a terrible, obviously it's a terrible, precursor to a lot of other health issues. So that's obviously a huge problem. Then you've got obesity rates in the U.S. in particular. So I just read you the statistics: 76% of adult men, 73% of adult women. Obesity rates have actually doubled in the last 30 years only, as of 2024, with that number again projected to increase. So you're looking at, again, what are the reasons for that? So you've got a mix of things. There's also been a growth, a surge, actually, I should say, in ultra-processed foods. So ultra-processed food as a percentage of the American diet represented 70% of the American diet. So 70% of the calories that Americans take in are from ultra-processed foods. So that's horrific. That's terrible. And that's something that a lot of people aren't talking about, is just how low quality the food has become, particularly in the U.S. And that same article says that for every 10% increase in the percentage of your daily calories that come from ultra-processed foods, you have a 17% higher risk of diabetes. So it's obviously a terrible, a terrible indictment on our diets of sort of how much ultra-processed foods we're eating. A similar study was also done by the U.S. government that showed that when taken sort of on an equal basis, somebody eating only ultra-processed foods versus non-ultra-processed foods, and left to their own devices to eat as much as they want until they were satiated, until they were satisfied, whatever, that in the U.S., the study participants ate on average an extra 500 calories, given the same question, which is go ahead, eat whatever you want, but it has to be only ultra-processed or not ultra-processed. 500 extra calories was Americans. Japan did a similar study and found that Japanese citizens ate an extra 800 calories when asked to only have ultra-processed foods as opposed to the opposite, which just goes to show, again, there's something about this food that, again, is either not very nutrient dense, whatever the case is, but people end up eating a lot more of it, and it's very clearly terrible for you. So you've had this explosion in ultra-processed foods, but then you also have an issue of lifestyle and exercise. So on average, a U.S. adult only walks 2,000 to 4,000 steps a day. So obviously that's well below the sort of that vaunted 10,000 steps a day. So we're very sedentary. So at the same time as our diets are getting worse, we're eating less nutrient dense food. We're eating, laboratory food more or less. We're also not being active. We're not moving. We're not running. We're not doing anything really to improve our lifestyle on either end, which is obviously causing a major issue. So this is something, again, that RFK Jr. in the U.S., who's likely to be the new Health and Human Services Secretary, has mentioned, which is you have the chemicals in American food, which is causing all these health problems or exacerbating these health problems. And there's a lot of these same chemicals that are banned in other countries that the U.S. itself hasn't banned, whether it's high fructose corn syrup or some of these other issues. So you've got all these things contributing to the worsening health for Americans and, again, globally. And then you've got this sedentary crisis, which is being driven, again, by technology. Rather than go out and, play sports or walk around or whatever the case is, we've got our phones, we've got our Netflix, we've got everything else that we could want. So it's creating this sort of double whammy effect of we're eating bad and we're not, being active. So it's a major problem, which is only getting worse. So again, what we see is that the U.S., the obesity problem alone, if you quantify obesity as and its related healthcare costs and issues, it costs the U.S. $1.7 trillion a year. So that's only expected to get worse. So you talk about healthcare, for example. You talk about healthcare in countries where you have nationalized healthcare systems, like in the UK, like in most parts of Europe, even in the US, where the government is somehow involved in healthcare, whether it's Medicare for the elderly, whether it's Medicaid for the poorer folks. Then you talk about what those costs are expected to be. Obviously, that's likely to balloon as the healthcare systems have to adapt to all of the issues associated with this obesity crisis, which again is getting worse, not better. So this is a major issue. So now we've got this miracle drug supposedly called Ozempic. So it's a drug used to treat diabetes, but as of the past couple of years, it's now been approved by the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration in the U.S., to treat obesity. So what we see is that in 2021, under the brand name of Wegovy, however you say that, essentially you've taken the same drug, the diabetes drug, and now it's being prescribed to people who have obesity to take an injection, whether it's once a week or sort of however they administer it, And this is being used now to treat people's quote unquote obesity. So again, the way Ozempic or this Wegovy, the brand name, work to treat obesity is that it's injected once a week in the stomach, the thigh, or the arm, and it lowers your blood sugar levels, regulates your insulin, which obviously is what makes it relevant for type 2 diabetes. But then it also it imitates this hormone that the body naturally produces, which serves to limit the appetite by signaling to your body that you're full. So again, it has that, it essentially, it limits your hunger, it limits your, whatever. So again, it imitates a hormone that your body naturally produces, which limits your appetite and makes you obviously want to eat less, whatever the case is. So that's being now touted as this sort of wonder drug, miracle cure to obesity. Maybe this is now going to be something that we can use as a society to address this issue. And my own personal view on that is I think it sounds really suspect at best that we're going to solve the issues that we're facing, whether it's, again, chemicals in our food, whether it's, again, poor diet, whether it's poor exercise habits, that now we're just going to take an injection, buy this drug, which, again, gives us this, this hormone that our body is supposed to naturally produce, and that somehow is going to be a cure without costs. So again, everybody's talking about this. Maybe it's a solution, and maybe it is a solution for some people. But what I would imagine is going to be a potential issue is that I think there's likely to be significant side effects associated with doing nothing other than taking an injection to create or mimic this hormone that for whatever reason your body isn't producing. What we're seeing is that you're already seeing a bit of an issue, and there are some side effects. So for example, some of the side effects that I noted down is that Ozempic, again, can lead to nausea, dehydration, fatigue, malaise, severe constipation. There are risks associated with the drug. So again, people who want to take it, what I would almost argue in lieu of, just doing the smart thing, which would be eat healthier, choose to have a better diet, choose to be more active. People looking for the easy way out, I think what we typically see is that there's no such thing as a free lunch in life in general. And obviously there are some negative impacts. So what the NHS in the UK has noted is that there's been a surge in hospital admissions that are linked to bad reactions to these weight loss drugs, which is much higher than what people thought initially. So you've seen, apparently, according to the Daily Mail here, that initially the expectation was that there was 274 cases of these bad reactions to these weight loss drugs, and apparently that number is significantly higher. That it's actually around 15,000, not 274. So again, there is going to be some cost associated with this. So what the article is saying is that we're seeing a surge in adverse reactions, hospitalizations involving gastrointestinal issues, nausea, vomiting, constipation, diarrhea, etc. So again, we can try to maybe take this approach of fix the problems with our of our choices, right? The things that we've done, which is either not eat well, which is either choose not to exercise, choose to live unhealthy lives. And then we can try to remedy that with, again, another sort of miracle drug or a miracle pill or whatever the case is. But I personally don't see that making a lot of sense. I don't see that working in the long term. Again, people like RFK Jr. have also sort of highlighted that as being probably not the way out and probably not the solution. So interestingly, I also did a little bit of research into understanding, okay, so we have all these issues, right? We have these issues around obesity. We've also got other issues, whether it's mental health, whether it's heart disease, whether it's any of these sort of now commonplace problems. And I wanted to understand, so again, whether people want to say Ozempic is a solution or something else, is there an ideal, or is there a, because from my perspective, I don't see any of these illnesses as being natural. I don't think the natural state of a human being is to be obese, for example. I don't think the natural state of a human being is to be depressed or to be anxious or to be, suffering from heart disease at age 40. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. So I was able to find some pretty interesting research that was done. This is back from an article published by the BBC in 2017 that analyzed the healthiest hearts in the world. So again, if you're going into what some of the leading causes of death, leading causes of healthcare problems, obesity, cardiovascular, if we look into, I think, this example, it's actually quite interesting as to what the takeaways are as to why these people had such healthy hearts. So this article looked at a tribe of people in the forests of Bolivia, and it noted that, and this is a direct quote, barely any of the members of this tribe had signs of clogged up arteries even into old age, which again is, the complete opposite of what we would see in modern society. And that really goes for any modern society, whether it's Asian society, Middle Eastern society, European society, American society, really doesn't matter. Now, people might criticize, and we'll show the article and we'll show some the data and whatnot. This is a hunter-gatherer tribe. So obviously you're not going to be able to mimic exactly the way these people live. But there are some key takeaways and some interesting takeaways that if we were to say, adopt some of these things into our daily life, probably we'd have a lot less problems than we do now from a healthcare perspective and just overall. So these guys live in the Bolivian forests. They are hunters, they fish, they farm, etc. But if you look at their diet, and that's very interesting, their diet and their exercise. So the two things we're talking about that we're eating in the West and in the US in particular, 70% of our food is ultra processed, and we're walking 2,000 to 4,000 steps a day. So we're not moving and we're eating food that's, just complete junk, completely bad for us. Their diet, again, comes from completely natural sources. So 17% of their diet is wild pig, and then a couple of other, the world's largest rodent, some other tapir, I have no idea what that is. They eat a lot of fish, piranhas, catfish, and then they grow a lot of, again, maize, rice, sweet potatoes, plantains, things like that, and then some fruit and nuts and whatnot. So what the takeaway was is that, again, they actually eat a lot of carbs. So people talk about carbs and want to demonize carbs. 72% of their diet comes from carbs, whereas only 52% in the US. 14% comes from fat, whereas 34% in the US comes from fat. And then we have about the same protein. But again, all the sources that they eat are natural, whereas we're getting that from, again, laboratory food, ultra-processed food in many cases, and things like that. And then the most interesting thing to me, so again, I think that draws one parallel. These are people, even in old age, that have almost no signs of any clogging in the arteries. Almost none, right? And we have, you have evidence of clogging in the arteries in young American adults, right? When you're in your 20s, you start to show very clear signs of some level of early cardiovascular disease, definitely for a lot of people in their 30s. And these people are not even showing it even as they're in their old age, 60s, 70s, etc. So again, that's one point. All their food is natural, so nothing ultra processed. And then we go into the fitness thing. And this is very interesting to me because these people are extremely fit. And again, it goes into, we're looking at this double whammy that we're giving ourselves, which is eating crap food, eating junk food, and then not moving. Again, 2,000 to 4,000 steps a day in the US. These people, the men in this community, walk 17,000 steps a day on average, and women 16,000 steps a day on average. People over 60 in this tribe walk still over 15,000 steps a day. So again, we're talking about walking 10,000 steps a day as if it's extremely difficult, and actually for a lot of us it is. And for Americans, we're falling far short of that. And these people are walking 17,000, 16,000 steps a day. So obviously they're getting a ton of exercise, or at least a ton of movement. They're not sedentary at all. So some of the takeaways from that were that the scientists looked for what's called CAC, coronary artery calcium, which is the clogging of the blood vessels, raises your risk of a heart attack. And it said that of 705 people, so in this tribe where they did this research, by age 45, almost nobody in the group had any signs of this building up of calcium in the arteries, whereas 25% of Americans did. So you had roughly 0 for these guys, 25% for Americans. By the time these people were 75, so only 1/3 of the tribe had any buildup of calcium in the arteries whatsoever, but 80% of Americans did. So a huge distinction around, again, building up of calcium in the arteries between this tribe and between Americans. So obviously, what does that mean? So what can we take away from that? So clearly, now what's also interesting is that what else can we say here? So yeah, so what can we take away from this? I think, again, rather than panic about the obesity crisis, rather than rush to take that Ozempic jab, which, again, might work for your obesity, but all that's doing is artificially suppressing your hunger. So at the end of the day, maybe there's going to be other issues associated with that. You still need to obviously get good nutrition. You still need to live a healthy life because you're only solving one particular issue, which is the obesity problem. Maybe you eat less. Eating less doesn't necessarily make you that much healthier. So what we're looking at here is if the ideal, if the healthiest hearts on the planet are these people who eat, natural food, purely natural food, and walk a lot. They get a lot of exercise. That seems to me like a pretty easy solution that people can take, which is rather than, put down the French fries, put down the ice cream, have something more natural, have natural meat, have natural, vegetables or something like that. If you can incorporate more of that into your diet and actually walk and move around and, and not be so sedentary, it seems like we could make a massive dent into the obesity issue, into the health crisis that we're obviously seeing. So very long story short to what Vlad's question was, if I can go back to the question. So very long story short, back to Vlad's original question, do I think this is going to be solved with more healthcare spending or a lifestyle issue? No, I don't think it's going to be solved by healthcare spending, just like I don't think the war on drugs is going to be solved by spending more money to fight this thing. At the end of the day, these are things that we individuals have the freedom and control over, which is put down the ice cream, put down the French fries, get out, go for a walk, do some exercise, and these small adjustments at the individual level, this solves the obesity issue. It's not going to go away completely, obviously. Life is getting more and more sedentary. It's easier to sit at home all day and watch Netflix, order in the ice cream and French fries, but if you can do these things, and if we can embrace that as sort of at the society level, there's a lot of progress that could be made relatively quickly. Now, again, very difficult to do. I, again, don't think this is going to be solved because I actually don't think people will do it. But if I were to categorize this issue, it's not going to be solved with spending. It's not going to be solved with, just give people all these new drugs and whatnot. I think it's going to be solved by people need to embrace culturally, exercise, eat well. It's all sort of, it's in our hands to do that. It's just a matter of do we do it? So that's my response to the healthcare crisis, and that's my response to that question. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in to another episode of the Culture Clash podcast. If you like what we do, subscribe to us on YouTube, give our videos a like, follow us on Instagram, and with that, we'll see you next week.